Welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is episode 387, recorded on the 28th of July 2021. And on Teams today, we have Sajid, Evan, myself, Cynthia, and our very special guest, Lior Kamrat, to talk about Azure Arc. And before we get into the topic, as usual, we have a couple different updates to share. And I know Sajid has a networking one that he's going to steal from.
I'm going to let Evan handle it. I value our friendship too much to try to steal his points.
I haven't even been on the networking team for 3.5 years now, and I've still claimed my little space. It's awesome. So there's a couple actually cool networking ones. So if anybody's ever used Network Watcher, right, one of the really cool features of Network Watcher is traffic analytics. Basically, this is some built, when you turn it on, we start collecting telemetry using NSG flow logs, and it tells you, where you've got top talkers, what your traffic is doing. It can help identify problems in your overall network. And what's really cool is the problem with traffic analytics is if you don't turn it on until you need it, you've already missed your problem. Right now you're sitting around waiting for it to reoccur. And so what we've added policy support for this so that you can go in with Azure policy and say, hey, all new subscriptions with such and such tag will have this enforced by default, which means it's always there. Right. And so I love that as somebody who spends my life debugging things that are broken, right? The world where you can hand me the data the first time it broke is such a better place than me looking you in the eye and saying, yeah, I'm sorry, it's got to break again before we can tell you what happened. So definitely recommend people check this out.
Is there some sort of trigger that there's some anomaly and it tells you, or is it more of that it's there already and it's ready for you when you get triggered elsewhere?
I'll have to guess what we may have to do a show on it, because I'm not sure offhand what kind of alerting it has built into it. I would be surprised if there's not some level of alerting based on common scenarios, retransmits, usage, things like that, because that's sort of the a real classic scenario. And then other things as the other big other piece of news this week. One, Azure Virtual Desktop supporting Azure AD domain or Azure AD joined virtual machines. And then the last one, also in the Azure Virtual Desktop world, is remote app streaming. This I thought was really neat, because this is not so much for you as a user of Virtual Desktop, although you would certainly end up using the results of this. But this is for companies that are selling software that want to push their software into these virtual desktops so that now they can do software as a service for their customers using per user licensing. And so now you don't have to have this, you don't have to build your app so it runs as a service somewhere. It can just run in a Windows Virtual Desktop, and you can access it through Azure Virtual Desktop. So I thought that was a really cool, sort of going back to our roots in terms of enabling developers to reach a larger audience.
And Evan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the remote app streaming was available previously for physical or on-premise machines, right? You could still stream.
I'm actually not sure. I suspect so. Yeah. I think we just hadn't really. You could do some of this with Azure Virtual Desktop, but I think the integration is really making it easier for developers to turn this on, yeah. Right? As well as the per user, right? Because per user is really the way to go. Then if you have users that use it, then you're charging. If nobody's using it, you don't have to pay for it.
Thanks.
Any other updates from anyone?
All I can say here is that, Ivan, hearing you saying that you haven't been with the team for 2 years, so just come to share with you, TCP is still the same, UDP is unreliable, and nothing has changed in that world. I just want to say that.
I am living proof of
that.
They
haven't changed that, if you're wondering.
Yeah. Yes. I get surprised periodically with DNS over over HTTPS now. Like basically, there's an encrypted DNS now, and that threw me for a
See, you
loop
already
about.
started to forget.
Yeah, exactly. I'm very happy with that. But networking is still networking from 10 years ago in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And now we're gonna turn it over to you, Lior. Can you introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us what you do at Microsoft?
Sure. My name is Lior Kamrat. I'm an architect in the Global Partner Organization based here in the US. And my role is leading the hybrid efforts inside Microsoft US when it comes to more specifically around Azure Arc. That's what I spend probably 150% of my time. And I'm also the author and the creator of the Azure Arc Jumpstart project. So that's what I do. And 387 episodes. Wow, that's a lot. I didn't know that you
Networking
guys
was
have
still
this,
the same
this kind of
back
run.
then when we started, right? Going back to our previous.
Yeah, right. But yeah, congrats on that, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Azure Arc has been around for a while now. I know it was a little slow getting out of the gate there. I think there was a little bit of a basic understanding problem, like what Arc brought to the table. I mean, if someone were to ask you, how might Arc benefit me, what would be your first response?
I would say that if you like Azure, we'll bring it to you. That's really what it is. If it all boils down to this, it's also something that you want to think about when it comes to a software-based hybrid solution and not a physical-based hybrid solution. I'll explain. Before Azure Arc, the hybrid strategy when it comes to Azure was really around the stack family. That was the story. That's what we were telling customers. That's what we were telling partners, and that was the strategy. But if you're thinking about the stack solution offering, it's really something that is somewhat limited when it comes to how you approach a broad perspective of a customer when they want to do hybrid. So Azure Arc really is about stretching our control plane, Azure Resource Manager, right? The way I like to look at Azure Resource Manager is like the operating system of Azure, right? That's really what it is. And the different resource provider that we have, right? If you want to take that to let's just say to the Windows world for a second, is those DLL files that assembling the drivers. That's really what it is. So if you're thinking about Azure Arc, stretching a control plane, and I always like to use the term projecting resources that are deployed outside of Azure and bring those into Azure, that's really where the magic starts, because that's the first phase of us bringing Azure to you, because that means that now your VMware virtual machines or your Rancher Kubernetes cluster that you have deployed or your SQL server that is sitting in some sort of a factory or warehouse, now those resources have representation in Azure, meaning that they're first-class citizens inside the control plane, Azure Resource Manager. So that's the first part. And the second part is, how do we take some of our services and deploy those outside of Azure? And that's a really funky and cool thing to do, because that's why I meant when I said, if you like Azure, we'll try to bring it to you, right? Talking about services like SQL Managed Instance or PostgreSQL Hyperscale, or what we have with app services like logic apps and web apps and functions, event grid, API management, all these stuff. That's really where things are starting to get interesting when it comes to hybrid application architecture. So that's why I'm excited about this space and the opportunities that it brings.
So when you say, you talk about sort of bringing Azure to you, this is Azure evolving beyond the concept of just being sort of the public cloud, right? It sounds like we're evolving to, hey, this is there is a data plane to everything that we're doing, but it's really the management plane, to your point, is the value proposition, right? I shouldn't care where my stuff is, but I still want to manage it all just the same way. Is that the right way to think about where Arc is pushing this?
Yeah, it's really that, and it's not just for, because when you're thinking about a management plane, usually what people tend to think about is, oh, so the IT ops person will now have this way of managing his VMware virtual machines and connect those into Azure Monitor. Sure, that's right, but there's more to that. It's really about trying to capture all these different personas that you have in the organization and bring added value to their day-to-day using Arc. So, Azure Arc enabled servers really focusing on those monolith applications, IT ops related personas that really looking at things from that point of view, right? Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes and app services, and obviously data is really about the developers, the data personals, the people that trying to understand how to build hybrid applications or trying to think about hybrid architecture. So I think it goes broader than that, but it opens a lot of possibilities.
In terms of the progression and the end goal of customers that are taking a hybrid approach, is hybrid the end goal, or is there something else they have in mind?
I think that it's a very good question, and it boils down to the business aspect of the organization. If the organization see value in going all in with just a public cloud, right? Doesn't matter if it's Azure, AWS, GCP, it doesn't matter, right? If that's the decision, I think that hybrid is not really something that they're thinking about probably the way that you and I thinking about our hybrid. I think that if an organization is trying to go all in with the public cloud, the things that are stayed behind are just maintenance points. Okay, it's just a kind of an overhead on the organization that is still there, needs to be maintained, and that's how we address that. If the organization have this, I want to say, target goal of being all over the place in a controlled fashion and in a way that it's not sprawling all around and in a way that they know how to address that, I think Azure Arc brings a good solution, meaning that, sure, you can be across the board when it comes to your resources. You can really deploy things in different ways, but think of us as the brain of the octopus when it comes to all these resources being managed in a very centralized place, right? So that's really, so to answer the net of your question, is it the end goal? I think that it's not a question of an end goal. It's really, is it the end state of mind goal? Meaning that if you know that you're going to stay in hybrid world, sure, you need to prepare for that mentally when it comes to how do you operate with your teams, how things are spread across the board. If your goal is to just making sure that the lights are still on, you're not really thinking hybrid in that sense. So yeah, I hope that answered the question. It sounds fancy, but yeah.
Yeah, Lior, I remember way back from the early Azure Arc days, at least, is that the two main use cases used to be monitoring and I believe governance or policy management, right, across all these distributed systems.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I mean, I understand the whole value proposition from a control plane perspective. But when I hear hybrid, right, for me as an application developer, it means that I have some application servers on premises and some in the cloud, right? And often that means talking between the two of them. But I believe that Azure Arc doesn't solve the problem of allowing these two things to connect, right? We still need traditional express route connections and whatnot if we have to make that connection work. Is that correct?
Networking.
Well, I guess that if you're looking at the way that not traditional, but if you look at the way that applications are being developed with a modernized state of mind, you're thinking, okay, everything runs in Azure and everything is magically connected and that's all good. So now, going back to this use case conversation, if you're thinking about a use case that is data sovereignty, right? And that's one of the big use cases when it comes to Azure Arc enabled data services specifically, right? Because what we're doing is we're going to deploy those SQL servers or Postgres servers on your Kubernetes clusters that are deployed inside the factory, and that stays there. The data stays there, the storage, like everything is there, right? So when it comes to the way that the connection is going to work, obviously, if you have a web application that's supposed to, talk, or a function that's supposed to talk to, ODBC connection string that is on premises, sure, the packets needs to go somewhere, and ExpressRoute is probably the most robust way of doing things. But there are also like public protocols that can be used in a secured fashion in order for you to do that. So I guess that my answer for this one will be, sure, you need to make sure that that connectivity is in place, but there is also a reason you did it that way, right? It's not like someone forced you to build that application in that way. You had a specific use case. Specifically on this one, I talked about data sovereignty, and that's what you decided to go with. So,
yeah, and I only call that out because I believe the Azure Arc connectivity model is inbound into Azure, right? So in fact, the connections in the factory, the Kubernetes cluster itself, is making a connection back into Azure. Azure doesn't have an actual connection into the doesn't make a connection into the factory, so to speak. Is that correct? It's created in reverse.
Right. And yeah, and specifically with data services, it's the data control plane that is responsible for that to be in this traffic cop, right? So yeah.
Thank you.
Sort of follow-up question on that. How does Azure Arc actually work? Like, how does it enable your servers, and what makes it possible now that Azure has insights and is able to manage and govern it?
Yeah. So to understand that, you really need to understand that Azure Arc is not a single product. It's a set of technologies, right? So, and every technology has a representation inside the resource manager, meaning that we have a dedicated resource provider for that specific technology, right? So Azure Arc enabled servers has its own resource provider inside Azure Resource Manager. Same goes for data services, Kubernetes, app services, whatnot, and machine learning. Now, each resource provider works differently in the way that things are being represented in Azure, but the main two pillars when it comes to connectivity models, or the way things are represented in Azure is it Azure Arc enabled servers or Azure Arc enabled services, right? And services can be data services, machine learning, and app services as of today, because those are based on a Kubernetes model deployment, right? Or Kubernetes-based deployment, meaning that you're going to have a very specific way of projecting those resources using what we call the extension model and the control planes that we have as part of this deployment, right? So data services will have its own control plane, app services has its own control plane, machine learning has its own control plane, and those are responsible for this projection of resources, right? Servers, it's something that's being done via an agent that you're deploying on your operating system on premises or in the servers that you want to project, and that agent is responsible for talking to that resource provider, right? So a bit different, but kind of the same approach when it comes to a resource provider, a single resource provider to rule that specific technology. Now, the compliance thing and all the other use cases that are possible, that's just a result of us being able to project those resources. Because once those resources are projected as Arc resources, that's it. You're already have representation in Azure and connecting you to these peripheral services. That's the easy task, quote unquote, right? So that's how things are being done when it comes to that connectivity and projection models. So,
and I believe Lior, there is an agent that sits in each of these servers, right? I believe we deploy the customer has to deploy some sort of a custom agent on the boxes.
Yeah, when it comes to servers, it's based on the connected machine agent. That's the name of the agent, and that agent is responsible to talking to the resource providers. In the case of Kubernetes, which is the fundamental building block for all the other services, basically we're deploying control planes for each one of those services as Kubernetes manifests or Kubernetes pods that connects to services. And from that point, you have the entire Kubernetes architecture shebang that needs to come, and fall into place. So, yeah.
I think you just answered my question, because I was going to ask, given what you were describing, there's Arc enabled SQL MI, and
right.
the way that ends up working, if I understand right, is basically SQL MI is running with an AKS, but now it ties into what you were just talking about. So theoretically, if a service and this is sort of from the Microsoft perspective, but if a service wanted to deploy themselves in an Arc enabled scenario, they have to tie into one of these deployment factors that you're talking about, and then Arc can manage it for them. Yeah. But me as a customer, like, I don't care. It doesn't matter. I want to install this resource, and what the architecture looks like, don't care. It's still Arc enabled.
And that's really fulfilling the goal of Kubernetes being a platform for platforms, right? Meaning that we don't care what type of Kubernetes flavors you have deployed, as long as it's CNCF certified and proven, you can Arc enable that Kubernetes cluster, which will be the first step. And from that point, again, using this type of extensions, you are able to deploy data services or ML or, the other things. So yeah.
In that scenario, does Arc manage my Kubernetes cluster for me, or do I have to have a layer that does that, and then everything else, all the Arc SQL MI and all that sits on top of that AKS? So I have to roll my own not AKS, but my own Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, it's a question that I'm getting a lot, and Arc doesn't manage anything per se. Arc, at the end of the day, it's a set of construction sets or building blocks to enable a specific technology, meaning that Arc is basically the wrapping of all these agents and RPs and data controllers and control planes in order for you to get to a point that you have those resources projected as first-class citizens inside Azure, right? So the way you want to think about Arc is not as, something that you buy off the shelf and just deploy. It's really a technology enabler that is, you might want to call it like a wrapper of technologies, right? Yeah. And each technology has its own specific gizmos and ways to enable that specific service. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
And I guess if I may to expand on that, so if I were to deploy my own Kubernetes cluster, let's say I have it at home, right, somewhere here, I have my own Kubernetes cluster, and I install the minimum pod that's required to connect to Azure Arc, right? I configure it and it's connected to Azure Arc. At that point, what can I do? I can go to the portal and I can say, hey, deploy a SQL cluster there. Like what are the next steps beyond that, and what happens under the covers?
So the first thing that you can do is use the Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes capabilities, right? Forget about services for a second, put that on hold. You have things like Azure Monitor for containers insights integration. You have GitOps, which is kind of a big deal. And from that point, that Kubernetes cluster is acting as the gateway for other services, right? Or I should say that Azure Arc resource is the gateway for all these other possibilities. Now, the way it's being done is the moment that you have this Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster, that basically gives you the option to deploy extensions against it, right? And each extension represents a different, you might say, Arc pillar, right? So you have extension for data services, you have extension for app services, you have extension for, logic apps, this type of stuff. So it's really the first thing that you need to do before you're diving into these other services. Another thing that you will need to do in order to enable those services is to deploy or create something that we like to call custom location, right? And a custom location is a mapping to a namespace inside the Kubernetes cluster, right? Because if you're thinking about this old concept of I have a Kubernetes cluster that is deployed outside of Azure, you really want to make sure that you have the ability to decide where those services are going to be deployed once you want to deploy those inside the cluster. So a custom location will map that into a specific namespace inside the cluster. So you can have multiple custom locations inside the cluster, and each custom location will represent a different type of solution or an application. So that's really the way the flow works.
So when I do say, to go deploy, let's say a SQL MI or SQL Server instance there, it'll spin up all the appropriate pods or replica sets or whatever it needs to enable that service on that cluster.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yes.
Lior, can you tell us a little bit more about Jumpstart?
Yeah, sure. So, the Jumpstart project is a project that we created, I want to say 14 or 15 months ago. And it was born from the notion of a gap that needed to be filled, meaning that if you're looking at Azure Docs today, we are doing a good job on documenting our own things, right? Because everything is Azure-based, it's our own, resources. Cool. But Azure Arc is unique in the sense that it, by design or by definition, touches everything that is not Azure, right? Kubernetes clusters that are not ours, VMware virtual machines, I don't know, like Google instances, EC2 instances, right? Stuff that got nothing to do with our platform. So we wanted to provide a way for us to document all these different infrastructure types, but also making sure that if you're coming from an Azure world and you are hardcore, Azure architect or, someone that is working with Azure, you will not fail but with Azure Arc. And the way for us to do that is to document really, really into the fine-grained details all these platforms, and also provide you with automations to do that. We call those scenarios. And these scenarios are basically kind of off-the-shelf representation of each use case that you want to go with, right? So for example, I want to deploy an EKS cluster in AWS, and I want that Kubernetes cluster eventually to hold my SQL managed instance that are deployed via data services, right? Stuff like that. And the way for us to do that for you is to basically provide you with the automation and the scenarios. Now, these scenarios are independent, so to speak. And we also created another project inside the Jumpstart, like the overall Jumpstart project or another product, which called ArcBox. And ArcBox is our way to deploy everything in your own subscription. So you will be able to simulate everything that is Azure Arc, and you won't have to go to and open an account with AWS or GCP or have a full-blown VMware environment in order for you to experience the full richness of our capabilities, right? So it's a more opinionated deployment model than each one of the scenarios. And there is room for both. It just really depends on what is it that you're trying to do.
Great. Is there any insights into what's coming down for Azure Arc? Anything that we can share?
Yeah, I think that if you're looking at that space of Azure Arc, what you want to start thinking about is how we're going to enable virtualization platforms, right? Like VMware or deployments that are based on Hyper-V or SCVMM or being managed by SCVMM, stuff like that. I think that lifecycle management for Kubernetes, that's going to be another big thing, and really expanding of the richness of the platform when it comes to thinking about how do we Arc enabled everything that we have in Azure, because the potential is there, right? It's really a question of what customers are telling us, who has the appetite to do what, and from that point, it's really about that. So there are a lot of things that are in the roadmap that we can share publicly, but there are things that you want to think about because we are thinking about those, and that's really about the private cloud, the virtualization layers, all these guys that needs to be Arc enabled in a scaled fashion, right? Not just one by one on a server to server basis. So this is one of the things that are coming. Yeah.
Awesome. Any last parting thoughts, Lior, you want to share with our listeners? Anything they should go look at? And of course, we'll include links, for instance, to Jumpstart in the show notes, but anything else you want to share?
Yeah. Well, I think that, like I said, Jumpstart is probably the first place you want to go if you want to start doing Azure Arc project and start looking at those. Obviously, Azure Docs, we have a lot of architecture documents or architecture diagrams that we're including in Azure Docs that are worth exploring. And there's also the YouTube channel for the Jumpstart project, which will give you all these demos in a very snackable fashion, and also Jumpstart Lightning, which are our own kind of talk show that we're bringing people to talk about their hybrid experience. So if you want to hear that from people that are not me, you'll be able to hear me talking to them and give them the floor to share their experience and what Arc really brought to the table when it comes to their day-to-day. So it's pretty cool and fun project that we're working on.
Awesome. Well,
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for
Thank
having me. 387.